Well, hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're doing another 3 types of stitches that every beginner should know. Today we're going to be talking about gathers, zigzag, and the lapped seam. And before we get started, just as a reminder, if you don't already subscribe to the channel, what's stopping you? Go ahead and hit subscribe and then be sure to click that bell so that way you can get notified every time we launch a new video. So let's get started. Cut. So the first stitch that we're going to be doing today is going to be the gathers. And gathers are super simple. I promise they're not scary. And it's a great technique just to have in the back of your pocket for those beautiful puffy sleeves or really full skirts that I'm sure you want to sew. So to get started, I'm going to be taking my 2x3 square and my 3x6 square. And I'm going to start working with the 3x6 square. And I'm going to start working on the edge that is the longest. So that is the 6-inch edge. So to get things started, we've already threaded up our machine. We're going to match the edge of the fabric at a 1/4 inch seam allowance. And then just like we did in previous videos, we're going to match the edge of the fabric up to the top of the oval in our presser foot. Now this is very important. We're not going to backstitch on this basting stitch. The stitch we're doing right now is called a basting stitch, so we're going to set our machine stitch length to the widest setting that it will go to. For my machine, that is a 5. For your machine, it might be a 4, a 5, or a 6, whatever. You're just gonna set it to a really wide stitch length, or long stitch length. So to get started, we're just going to line up our fabric. We've already done that, and we're gonna hit the pedal and let her rip. Whenever you get to the end, we're not gonna backstitch again. We're going to pull a tail, and you can already see it's kind of gathering. So we're gonna pull a tail about 5 inches long, and then we are going to cut that thread. You can use your snips, or you can use, if your machine has a handy dandy cutter, you can use that as well. So we're going to even those stitches out, and then we're going to do another stitch a 1/4 inch away from that stitch. So you're gonna have 2 basting stitches on your sample piece. So again, I'm just gonna match that up. Get my presser foot ready and my pedal ready. And then we are going to start stitching. Again, I'm not back stitching. I'm gonna pull it off so that way it is 5 inches from the edge. Use my handy dandy cutter. And now I have 2 beautiful stitches that are a 1/4 inch apart. So the next thing that you're going to want to do with your gathers is you're going to want to take the top 2 threads right here, and you're going to gently start to pull on them to create your gathers. So once it starts to gather, you're going to ease that stitch, and if it seems like it comes undone, that's okay. It's not coming undone. So you'll just pull it, ease that stitch all the way across, pull it, ease the stitch. Then we're gonna pull a little bit on the other side as well, just so that way we can have a nice even stitch. And you're just gonna start working these stitches evenly across this basting. So once you're done, or once you think you're done, you're gonna take your 2x3 square and you're going to make sure that your gathers are the same length as that 3-inch. So I've got a little bit right here that is not as gathered as I'd like it. So I'm just gonna pull a little bit more. And now I have beautiful, even gathers. Right there. So now what we're gonna do is we are going to flip this over. And this is where, if you have a few pins, it comes in handy. So you're going to match this edge to edge, right here, raw edge to raw edge. Make sure those corners are nice and even. And then you're going to pin a couple places and sew. Okay, so now that I have pins, handy dandy pins, thank you, set man, thank you. You're gonna take your pins and you're just gonna start for this little sample, I'm probably just gonna put 3 pins. So I'm just taking my pins and poking perpendicular to the stitch edge. So that way, if I do accidentally stitch over my needle, I don't break my sewing needle. So I have 3 lovely pins in my gather stitch now. And for all of our samples, I do work in 1/2 inch seam allowance. So now we're gonna sew 1/2 inch seam allowance along the edge of this gather. Before you do that, you're gonna wanna make sure that you put your machine back to its original settings. So I'm gonna put it back to a 2.6 stitch length. So, okay, back to 2.6 stitch length, and now we are going to sew this sample. So you're gonna line it up 1/2 inch seam allowance, make sure that the edge of the fabric is lined up with the edge of the seam allowance, and then the fabric also lines up with the top of the oval in the presser foot, and then you're going to hit the pedal and let her rip. For this, we are going to backstitch again, and as you sew, please be sure to remove your pins so that way you don't accidentally break your needle. So you're going to take your scissors, your snips, whatever you have, and you're going to just trim those strings from the edge. And then if this were a final garment, we would go ahead and remove the basting stitches with a seam ripper. So we'll just remove that bottom one right there, just because that is going to be shown on the right side. And just in case I forgot to mention it, all of this is done with right sides together unless otherwise specified by your pattern instructions. So to check and see if you still have some basting stitch on the right side of the fabric, you can just open it up and pull from this end too. It is a basting stitch, no back stitch, so you can just rip it out. Pretty easy. Nice lemon squeezy. And then on this side, you can just pull the other stitches out too. Okay. So now that I have the start of my gather stitch, what I'm gonna go do is I'm gonna go head over to my iron and I'm gonna press my seam allowance up towards the top of the sample. So, I'll be right back. All right, so that is how you make a gathered stitch. And this is great for skirts, sleeves, if you want to add fun accenting, ruffles and gathers to really any part of your garment, you totally can, and this is how you do it. So this is how the back looks. You'll notice that there are still, you'll see your 2 stitches, totally fine. If it does bother you, you can take them out. You can also do a zigzag stitch on this edge right here, so that way it keeps both of those together and keeps them from fraying. So that is how you do a gathered stitch. So the next stitch we're going to be talking about today is the zigzag stitch. And zigzag stitch is a stitch that you can use for a variety of things. For me, I predominantly use it whenever I am working with knitwear on my machine, my home machine, instead of using my serger. You can also use this as a hit and miss technique to finish your edges if you don't have a serger at home, or if you just don't want to do a French seam. You can also use this really as a decorative stitch if you really want to. So there's plenty of ways to use a zigzag stitch. It is on just about every single machine, home sewing machine. So it's a great stitch to have in your back pocket if you ever are working with knit or just need a quick zigzag somewhere on your garment. It also works great if you are fixing holes in pants, shirts, you name it. So we're gonna start with our fabric samples right sides together. So just a reminder, the right side of your fabric is the side where the pattern is most prominent, and the wrong side of the fabric is generally where the fabric is the most dull, or there is no pattern at all. So that's why I like to practice with quilted cotton. So we're gonna be doing 1/2 inch seam allowance here. So I'm gonna be matching up my edge of my fabric with the seam gauge on my plate at 1/2 inch. And then I'm going to make sure that the top of my fabric is at the top of the oval in the presser foot, and then I'm gonna let it rip. So I'm not gonna be back stitching at the beginning because my machine automatically locks it in. However, if your machine does not automatically lock it in, you will wanna go ahead and do a quick back stitch whenever you start your seam. So I'm gonna line my edge of my fabric up with the 1/2 inch seam allowance, and then I'm gonna make sure that the top of my fabric is in the oval. Make sure my thread is all through my presser foot, and I'll let it rip. Now when I get to the edge, I am going to backstitch just for 2 stitches, just because whenever I stop my machine, the zigzag does not automatically lock in place. And that is how you do a zigzag stitch on your machine. Like I said, these are great stitches to do with knitwear or decorative, or if you are fixing a hole in your pants or shirt or whatever, this is a great stitch to have in your back pocket and master as a seamstress. So the next thing we're gonna be talking about today is the lap seam. And lap seams are great to have in your back pocket if you are working with heavier fabrics. Think anything from like 12 ounces to about 20 ounces. This is the perfect seam for those fabrics. This seam allows you to have less bulk in your seam allowance whenever your seam is done. So to get started with the lap seam, we have our 2 sample pieces, our water-soluble dress pencil, and then I have a seam gauge. You can use a seam gauge if you're comfortable, or you can also use a clear ruler to get the perfect line for the seam. So to get things started, we're gonna start on the right side of our sample pieces. And we're going to take our water-soluble dress marker and our seam gauge, and we're going to start by marking 1/2 inch away from the seam allowance on the right side. So that is, for me, going to look like so. And you're just going to make a few lines on your fabric that you can see. This is going to come in handy because we are going to be pressing along with matching these edges together. Okay, so once I have it done on one side, I'm going to do the same exact thing on the other side. So again, I am just marking 1/2 inch seam allowance on my sample. Now that I have both of my seam allowances marked on both right side of the sample pieces, I'm going to head over to my iron, and I'm going to fold back the top piece at that 1/2 inch line that I just marked. So give me a second, I'm gonna run over the iron. Okay, so now that I've pressed the top sample piece with the 1/2 inch seam allowance back, I'm going to line up the edge of this sample to the line that I drew on the other side of the fabric. So once that line is drawn, once it's all matched up, I'm gonna take my pins, and I'm just gonna do a couple pins as more of just a stabilization than anything. This helps prevent it from shifting, along with just making it easier to get a nice, clean finishing stitch. So now that I have this all lined up, I'm going to go to my machine, and I'm going to do what's called an edge stitch. An edge stitch is done at anything from a 1/16 of an inch to an 1/8 of an inch away from the edge that you are sewing from. So what that looks like on your machine is you're going to have you're going to match the top of the fabric to the top of the oval, and the edge that we matched up is going to line up about 1/8 of an inch to 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the presser foot. It's okay if you can't kind of eyeball it, if you haven't been sewing for a while. You can also always just measure it using a seam gauge, which is what this tool is. This is your seam gauge, just use your seam gauge and measure it out. So once you have it all nice and lined up, you're going to make sure that your machine is set to the right stitch. Make sure you're not on a zigzag stitch anymore. And you're going to get started. You're going to back stitch at the beginning and at the end of the stitch. Be sure not to stitch over your pins, as there is a high rate of breakage with your needle. And that is how you do a beautiful lap seam. So there is another step that if you want to add some extra stability to your seam, you absolutely can. That is just stitching another stitch exactly like you just did, anywhere from 1/4 of an inch to as wide as about 1/8 of an inch less than your seam allowance. So if I were to do another stitch, I would do about 3/8 away from that original stitch line to have a beautiful double needle top stitch looking seam. So that is your lap seam. All right, well, that's it for today's video. So today we touched on the lap seam, the zigzag stitch, and the gathers. So I hope that you really enjoyed today's video. I hope you learned something from it. I hope you feel more confident in your sewing. That is ultimately why I love doing samples. It just helps me feel more confident in my final product, and it makes me feel okay to mess up along the way. So if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to this channel and hit the bell so that way you get notified whenever we launch new videos. So thanks so much and happy sewing.